I still remember the sting more than the sound, more than the gasp from the crowd, more than the slight pause in the music or the way someone dropped a glass in shock and it shattered at the exact same time my dignity did. I remember the way his hand felt across my face, not just the pain, but the message it carried. That message of complete disrespect, humiliation, and dominance. That unspoken rule in our house finally brought out in public, for everyone to witness, and when I turned, to look at the sea of faces staring at me, stunned and unsure whether to pretend it didn't happen, or to reach out and comfort me. I locked eyes with her, my sister, my own flesh and blood, and she clapped. She actually clapped, like it was some kind of joke or performance or moment of triumph. Her hands coming together slowly at first, and then more confidently, like she was proud. Proud that Dad had finally put me in my place in front of 30 people, half of whom were extended family. The rest, old family friends or people from Dad's work, all there to celebrate his promotion. And now, all unwilling witnesses to the night my already crumbling self-worth was ground into the floorboards by the man who used to carry me on his shoulders, and cheered on by the girl I once protected from bullies at school, the one I used to tuck into bed when she had nightmares, and as everyone else tried to find some way to pretend they hadn't seen it, too nervously sip their drinks or whisper to the person beside them. I stood there, frozen, feeling my face heat up from the slap and the shame, my eyes burning from unshed tears, and when I finally turned and walked out the front door, no one followed, not Mom, not any of the aunts who used to dote on me, not even the uncle who always said I was like a son to him, and definitely not my sister, who stayed inside and laughed with the rest like it was the highlight of the party. And I kept walking down the driveway, away from the house I used to call home, into the night. Into the quiet and the cold and the realization that I didn't belong there anymore. Maybe never really had. And as I reached the end of the street, I sat on the curb and let the tears come, not just because of the slap, but because of everything it represented. All the years of quiet dismissals, the passive-aggressive comments, the favoritism that had become so ingrained in our family dynamic, that I started to believe I was the problem, that I was too sensitive, too stubborn, too much. And as I wiped my face and stared up at the stars, I remembered the look in Dad's eyes right before he hit me. Not anger, not frustration, but something colder, more calculated, like he wanted to hurt me, not just physically but in a way I wouldn't recover from, like he knew exactly how to cut the deepest, and chose that moment, that party, that audience, because he wanted it to be final. A declaration that I was no longer welcome, and the worst part is, he succeeded. Because that slap did more than sting. It split something inside me, something that had been barely holding together for years. And the applause the applause was the final blow. And I think that was the moment I stopped being their child and became just a ghost. Someone they used to know. Someone who had outlived his usefulness. And so I sat there on the curb until my phone buzzed. And for a split second I hoped it was someone checking on me, maybe Mom asking if I was okay, maybe even my sister, ashamed and apologetic. But no, it was just a calendar reminder about a dentist appointment, and the absurdity of that made me laugh. A broken, bitter sound that echoed in the stillness, and I stood up and walked toward the bus stop. No idea where I'd go, just knowing I couldn't go back there. Not tonight, maybe not ever. And as I waited under the flickering streetlight, I replayed the moment again and again, trying to understand what I had done to deserve it, and all I could think of was that I had spoken up. I had disagreed with Dad about something so minor, some offhand comment about politics, and I dared to challenge him, to push back, and that was the last straw. Because in our house, you didn't challenge him, not unless you wanted to pay. And I had, in front of everyone, I had paid, and as the bus pulled up and I climbed aboard, I wondered how long it would take for the whispers to start, for the story to morph into something where I was to blame, where I provoked him, where I made a scene, because that's how it always went. And as the city blurred past the windows, I realized I was tired, so tired of trying to earn love from people who only gave it in crumbs, tired of explaining myself to a family that never wanted to understand me, and as the bus rolled on, I made a decision, one that I didn't fully understand yet, but that would change everything. I don't know if healing ever really ends, if one day you wake up and all the cracks are gone, or if you just learn to live with them, to run your fingers along the fault lines without flinching, to see them not as flaws, but as proof that you survived. And maybe that's enough. Maybe that's more than enough. And in the months that followed, life settled into something soft and steady, something that didn't require me to be on edge or alert. And I started trusting myself again, which might sound small, but it was huge. Because when you grow up being told that your instincts are wrong, that your feelings are exaggerated, that your memories are unreliable, it takes time to rebuild that internal compass, to believe that you can choose your path without second-guessing every step. But I was learning, and every day I didn't shrink myself to make others comfortable. Felt like rebellion, like a quiet revolution. And then one afternoon, while I was organizing the poetry shelf at work, I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. And against my better judgment, I answered, and it was my sister. Her voice tentative to careful, like she was reading from a script someone else had written. And she said, "I just wanted to talk." And I waited, holding my breath. and she said, "I've been thinking about what happened, about that night," and I could hear the tremble in her voice. But I couldn't tell if it was real or rehearsed, and I said nothing, just let the silence stretch, because it wasn't my job to fill the gaps anymore. And after a moment, she continued, "I didn't mean to hurt you." And I felt something sharp twist in my chest because that line, that vague deflection, was always their favorite shield. But I stayed calm, grounded, and said, "You clapped?" And there was silence again. A longer one this time. And then she said, "I know." And her voice cracked, and I could almost picture her standing in some hallway, the same way I had stood in so many growing up, trying to find the right words. And she said, "I was wrong. I was jealous. I thought if I sided with him I'd be safe. I thought if I laughed with everyone else, I wouldn't be next." And I didn't say anything because I didn't know what to say. Because part of me had wanted to hear those words for so long, but now that they were here, I didn't feel relief. I felt tired. Like I had carried the weight of that moment alone for so long that no apology could undo it. And she asked if we could meet, just to talk. And I told her maybe, not as a promise. Just as a possibility. Because I was allowed to decide now. Because my healing wasn't hers to rush or demand. And after we hung up, I sat with it, the way it echoed in my chest. And I realized something that surprised me. I didn't hate her. I just didn't know her anymore. Not really. Not outside of the roles we were forced into. And maybe that was the real tragedy of our family. That none of us ever really saw each other because we were too busy performing for the approval of one man who made us believe love had to be earned through silence and sacrifice. And now that I had stepped off that stage, I didn't know if I wanted to go back just to pull someone else out, especially if it meant losing what little peace I had built. And so I waited. And I kept waiting. Not out of indecision, but out of self-preservation. And in that waiting, I helped a customer find a book that changed her life. I sang off-key karaoke with Jordan in our tiny living room. I took long walks with no destination. I smiled without needing a reason. And one night, while watching a thunderstorm roll in, I realized I wasn't angry anymore. Not at Dad, not at Mom, not even at her. Because anger had been a shield. But I didn't need it now. I had boundaries. I had choice. I had love, not the kind they gave in pieces, but the kind I found in unexpected places, in friendships, in books, in stillness, in myself, and I didn't need them to see it or understand it. Because for the first time in my life, I wasn't living to be seen, I was living to be free. And that was more than I ever thought I'd have when I stood in that room, face burning, with 30 people watching and no one speaking up. And sometimes, when it rains, I still hear the silence after the slap, still feel the weight of their indifference. But then I hear Jordan laughing from the kitchen, or I feel the dog-eared edge of a book I love in my hands, and I remember who I am now, not the ghost of a child trying to earn love, but a person who chose to leave the room, who chose not to return, who chose to begin again. If that's not power, I don't know what is. I think what surprised me most wasn't how easily I adapted to life without them, but how natural it started to feel. Like all the things I used to beg for: quiet mornings, uninterrupted thoughts, the ability to exist without being dissected or judged were mine now, and had always been waiting for me on the other side of fear. And it made me wonder how long I had been clinging to a sinking ship, how many nights I wasted trying to patch holes in something that was never built to carry me. And the more distance I gained, the clearer the picture became. Like I was finally seeing my childhood through a clean lens. And it hurt. It hurt in ways I can't describe, realizing that the love I thought I had wasn't love at all. It was control dressed in sentimentality, manipulation coded in family, traditions, and fake smiles for holiday cards. And that's when the memories started hitting me harder, sharper. Like flashbacks, I couldn't turn off Dad making me redo a school project because it wasn't good enough for the son of a man. Like him, Mom ignoring my panic attacks and calling them melodrama, my sister stealing from my room and then crying until I got blamed. And I used to think it was normal. I used to believe that was just family, that maybe I was the broken one for not handling it better. But now I see how warped it all was. How I was raised to be a scapegoat and a punching bag and an emotional sponge for people who never took responsibility for their actions. And I started talking more in therapy, connecting the dots between my perfectionism and the need to be invisible, between my chronic guilt and the way they gaslit me into thinking I ruined everything. And I found pieces of myself in every session. Pieces I thought were lost or maybe had never existed. And I remember this one night, lying awake on Jordan's couch, the street lamp outside flickering through the window, and I whispered out loud, "I'm free," just to hear how it sounded, just to remind myself it was real. And I cried, not because I was sad, but because I never thought I'd make it here. And I started applying for jobs again. Nothing big, just something to get me on my feet. And when I got an interview at a bookstore downtown, I almost didn't go because a voice in my head still said, "You're not enough." But then I remembered Jordan's voice, and my therapist's, and even my own, and I went anyway, and I got it. And my first day was awkward and nerve-wracking, but also oddly joyful. And I met people who didn't know my story, who didn't look at me with pity or with expectations, Just coworkers who laughed when I made a bad pun and offered to cover shifts when I looked tired. And it felt like a second chance, like maybe I was building something real for the first time. And I began to understand what healing actually looked like, not a straight line. Not some dramatic montage of victories, but small moments, daily decisions, choosing to be kind to myself when the old programming wanted me to self-destruct, and slowly, I stopped checking my phone for their messages. I stopped caring about what they were saying behind my back, and I even started talking about the future again, with actual hope instead of dread. And one night, Jordan and I sat on the rooftop of his building, watching the city lights flicker like stars. And he asked me if I thought I'd ever talk to them again, and I thought about it for a long time before saying, maybe, if they ever actually see me. And he nodded, like he understood that it wasn't about an apology, it was about accountability, about someone finally saying, I was wrong and I hurt you, and I want to make it right. And deep down, I didn't believe they ever would, but I also didn't need them to anymore, because I wasn't waiting at the end of the driveway like I used to when Dad forgot to pick me up. I wasn't listening at the door hoping to hear something kind. I wasn't hoping to be chosen over her, or to be enough for them to stop hurting me. I had stopped waiting, and I had started living, and one morning, months after the party, after the slap, after the applause that shattered whatever was left of my family ties, I saw a post on social media, my sister's engagement announcement. Her smiling face, Dad in the background with the glass raised, Mom holding her clothes hand. I stared at it for a moment, expecting pain, expecting jealousy, but instead, all I felt was distance. Like watching strangers play out a scene I had once auditioned for, but no longer wanted a role in. And I closed the app and went back to my book, the coffee still warm in my hand, the morning quiet and unbothered. And that was when I realized the truth. I didn't miss them. I missed the version of them I created in my mind, the family I hoped they could be if only I tried harder, gave more, stayed quiet enough. But that family never existed. And the moment I let go of that illusion, I found something better. I found myself. The days that followed felt like standing on the edge of a cliff, terrifying but somehow exhilarating. Like the fear was real, but so was the freedom. And I kept waiting for the guilt to creep in, that voice in my head that used to parrot everything. Dad would say, "You're being dramatic. You're too sensitive. You brought this on yourself." But that voice was quieter now, weaker, like it had lost its power the moment I walked away. And maybe it was because I finally had space to breathe, or maybe it was just Jordan's constant presence. The way he didn't treat me like I was broken or fragile or in need of fixing, just human, and it was strange. Adjusting to kindness after so many years of conditional love, of having to earn every scrap of approval, of having to apologize just to exist in the same room. And the first time I laughed, I mean really laughed, over something stupid like Jordan tripping over his shoes or burning toast, I almost startled myself. Like my own joy was unfamiliar. Like my body didn't remember how it felt to just feel good without consequence. And yet in the background of this new piece, the chaos from my old life kept buzzing like a hornet, trapped behind a window, desperate to sting me one last time. Because the messages didn't stop. Not from Mom. Not from relatives who hadn't cared in years. Not even from my sister, who sent a single text that said, "You know Dad didn't mean it like that," followed by a heart emoji. Like that could erase what she'd done, what she hadn't done. Like that could cover up the sound of her hands slapping together while I stood there, humiliated and stunned. And I stared at that message for a long time, rereading it over and over. Not because I believed it, but because I couldn't believe the audacity. Because how do you justify applauding someone's pain and then try to gaslight them into forgiveness? And I didn't reply. I didn't even acknowledge it. Because some things don't deserve closure. Some people don't earn explanations. And I spent my energy instead on healing, on rebuilding, on figuring out what I wanted my life to be without their noise in it. And it wasn't easy. There were nights I woke up in a cold sweat, reliving the slap, the crowd, the burning in my cheek, and the silence that followed. The way everyone looked away like my pain was inconvenient. But there were also mornings where I sat by Jordan's window with a cup of tea and the sun on my face and felt something like hope. Like maybe I hadn't been wrong all along. Maybe I wasn't the villain they made me out to be. And I started journaling again. Something I hadn't done since I was 16, and Mom read my notebook and used it against me during one of her guilt trips. But this time I locked it away, and I poured out everything, memories I had buried, anger I had swallowed, dreams I had let go of just to survive under their roof. And the more I wrote, the lighter I felt, like the truth had been sitting heavy on my chest and now it was finally lifting. And one night, Jordan and I sat on the floor eating Chinese takeout, and I told him about the time Dad made me lie to the principal just to protect my sister, how she had cheated on a test and blamed it on me, and he backed her without even blinking, how I got suspended, and he grounded me for making the family look bad. And Jordan looked at me like he was seeing a crime scene, like he couldn't wrap his head around the cruelty of it. And I realized that night that I had normalized too much for too long, that I had mistaken survival for love, obedience for peace, and silence for safety. And that realization both broke me and set me free. And I started therapy the next week. Not because I thought I was broken, but because I wanted to make sense of the pieces they'd scattered. And the therapist, a kind woman with soft eyes and a sharp memory, asked me to tell her what I wanted out of life. Not what my family expected, not what I'd been told to want, but what I wanted. And for the first time I said it out loud. I want to feel safe. I want to be seen. I want to live, without having to shrink myself. And she nodded and said, "You deserve that." And I cried right there in her office because no one had ever said that to me. Not like that. Not without a but attached to it. And it hit me how starved I had been for kindness. How desperate I was for someone to just believe in me. Without agenda. And slowly, painfully, I started believing in myself, too. And meanwhile, the world I had left behind kept trying to claw its way back. Mom called from a private number. Dad sent a vague apology email that was more about how it looked bad in front of others than any real remorse. And my sister posted some cryptic story about how people love to play the victim, and I didn't respond to any of it. I just let them scream into the void. Because I wasn't listening anymore. I wasn't playing the role they assigned me, and I knew, deep down, that the moment I left that house, I broke a cycle they never thought would end. I changed a script that had been written generations before I was even born, and maybe that's why they were so desperate to pull me back. Not because they missed me, but because I threatened the lie they built their lives around. And I had no intention of going back. Not for birthdays, not for holidays, not even for apologies wrapped in guilt. And one evening, while walking through a quiet park, I realized I wasn't angry anymore. Not in the way I had been. Because anger had served its purpose it had woken me up. Burned the bridge I needed to escape, but now, in its place, there was clarity. And clarity is a dangerous thing to people who rely on confusion and shame to control you. And I smiled to myself for no reason. Just because I could. Just because I was alive and walking and breathing without their permission. And that was enough. The bus was nearly empty. Just me, an elderly man who kept nodding off, and a young couple arguing softly in the back. And I sat halfway between them, not wanting to be close to anyone. Still holding my cheek like I could rub the memory away. Like the warmth of my own hand could somehow undo the way Dad's palm landed with such finality. Like a gavel, like a verdict. And as I leaned my head against the cold window and watched the blur of lights and concrete pass by, I felt this hollow ache build inside me. Not just from tonight, but from years of swallowing my pain to keep the peace. From always being the one who apologized first, even when I wasn't wrong. From watching my sister get praised for things I was punished for. From sitting quietly while they made me the scapegoat over and over. And I remembered birthdays where no one showed up because my party conflicted with hers, and how she got the bigger gifts, the louder songs, the brighter candles, while I got told to stop complaining, to grow up, to act like the older sibling I was. And it hit me all at once how I had spent so long trying to be what they needed that I never figured out who I actually was. And now here I was, nearly 21, with no one to call and nowhere to go, trying to convince myself that I wasn't the villain in this twisted family narrative, even though I could already hear Dad spinning it in his head. Telling the party guests I overreacted, that I disrespected him, that he only slapped me because I pushed him too far, and maybe some of them would believe him, especially with my sister grinning and clapping like I had done something outrageous, and I couldn't help but wonder what would have happened if anyone had stood up for me, even once, even just to say that wasn't okay. But they didn't, because they never did. And that's when it finally clicked, when the fog lifted just enough for me to realize that I didn't need their approval anymore. I didn't even want it, because if that's what love looked like to them, then I'd rather have none of it. And with my chest still tight and my eyes puffy from crying, I pulled out my phone and messaged the only person I still felt safe with, Jordan. My best friend since high school. The one who always saw me. Really, saw me. Without the filters and the family narrative and the judgment. And I typed out something simple. Just, can I crash at your place? Something happened, and within seconds he replied, always. Doors open, and I almost cried again. Not from pain this time, but from relief. Because even though he lived in a tiny studio apartment above a pizza shop, it felt like the safest place in the world. And when I finally got off the bus, 2 stops before his, and walked the extra distance just to clear my head, I realized how scared I was, not of Dad, not even of what he did, but of what that slap unlocked in me. Because it wasn't just sadness I felt anymore, it was fury, it was clarity, and most of all, it was freedom. And when I knocked on Jordan's door, and he opened it wearing pajamas and holding a slice of cold pizza, I stepped inside and felt my body release all the tension it had carried for years. Like I had finally escaped something that had been suffocating me slowly. And I didn't even speak right away. I just sank onto his couch and stared at the ceiling. And he didn't ask questions, just handed me a blanket and sat quietly beside me. And in that moment, I knew I couldn't go back, not just to the house, but to the version of myself that had tolerated all of it for so long. And the weirdest part was that I didn't even miss them. Not really, because what was there to miss? Being silenced, being blamed, being unloved. And when I finally told Jordan what happened, every detail, every flash of memory from the slap to the applause, he didn't try to rationalize it or soften it. He just said, that's abuse. man. And I think hearing it out loud, in someone else's voice, made it real in a way I hadn't allowed before. And we sat there for hours, just talking. And when I finally fell asleep on his couch, I dreamed of silence, of peaceful silence, not the uncomfortable kind we had at home, but the kind that lets you breathe. And I woke up to the smell of coffee and bacon and the sound of Jordan humming along to some 90s R&B song. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like I was walking on eggshells. And over breakfast, he asked me what I wanted to do, and I didn't have an answer yet. Because I didn't know where to begin when everything you thought was home turns out to be the cage you escaped from. But I told him I wanted to figure it out, and he smiled and said, "That's enough." And we spent the rest of the morning making a list of things I'd need. A new phone plan, maybe a part-time job, and when I opened my social media later that day, I saw a dozen notifications, mostly from relatives who had been at the party. And every message was some variation of, "I'm so sorry," and "Are you okay?" and "Call your father." And it made me laugh again. Because where were they last night when I walked out alone? Where were they when I stood frozen in the aftermath of humiliation? And I realized they weren't messaging me out of care. They were messaging me out of guilt, out of fear that I'd speak, that I'd tell the truth. That the mask our family wore so perfectly might slip, and I didn't respond. I didn't owe them that, and when Mom finally messaged me, not with an apology, but with a paragraph about respecting your father, and you know how you can get, I blocked her, and it hurt. It hurt like hell, but not as much as staying would've. And that's how I began the process of choosing myself. Of letting go, one person at a time, one lie at a time. And as Jordan poured me another cup of coffee and asked if I wanted to crash with him for a while, I said yes. Not because I didn't have other options, but because it felt good to be somewhere I didn't have to explain myself. And as the afternoon light streamed through his window, I realized something. Maybe this was the beginning, not the end. Maybe walking away wasn't a failure. Maybe it was finally taking control of a life I'd spent too long giving to people who only ever saw me as a mirror for their disappointment. And I didn't know what would come next, but I knew this Muchai would never let them silence me again.